During his time in office, former President Donald Trump signed into law the First Step Act, a reform aimed at fixing federal prison sentencing guidelines, reducing recidivism, and freeing people who had been incarcerated for very lengthy sentences. Ended up freeing about 5,000 people from these outrageous sentences, in the words of former incarcerated actor and self-described militant activist and filmmaker Craig Scott, who wrote in a recent article for Newsweek.
Scott makes the case that the same criminal justice system Trump radically reformed is being used to discredit him. None of U.S. formerly incarcerated persons freed under the First Step Act are blind to that irony. Trump's mugshot only increases his street cred. That's the argument. Craig Scott joins us now to share his story. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me here.
Now, this has been a controversial proposition as a number of conservatives took to Twitter following the mugshot, making the argument that the existence of a presidential mugshot would naturally lead to increased support among Black Americans, the presumption being that Black Americans like mugshots or criminality or find that some kinship in his being indicted for election fraud crimes. Give me the argument as you understand it.
Well, I can understand that, from a cynical standpoint, but from a more, realistic standpoint, the mugshot represents an experience that a lot of disenfranchised Black and brown people here in America have experienced. And it's that common experience that makes Donald Trump relatable. It also focuses the fact that for some reason, the powers that be are after this guy. So all of those things is what are represented in the fact that they've got this mugshot of a former president floating around in the news.
Is it that, and also the President Joe Biden, the likely opponent of Donald Trump if he is the next nominee, has this history on criminal justice issues of being very punitive, going back to the policies he supported in the 90s that I believe I read your piece had to do with your own incarceration?
Exactly. I mean, this is like the most significant comparison or juxtaposition. Here's the one candidate who was the architect of a law that ended up creating what they call the mass incarceration movement. And then another candidate who literally came into office and systemically reversed that same law. So you can't be blind to the fact that these two candidates represent two opposing views when it comes to that particular issue.
How did Donald Trump systemically reverse the crime bill? My understanding is that some of the most insidious parts of the crime bill involve the crack cocaine disparity, which various Democratic presidents have unwound. And I certainly don't want to take any credit away from Donald Trump for the STEP Act, but I am curious whether or not it's really accurate to describe what Donald Trump did with the STEP Act as having systemically reversed the 1994 crime bill in all of its harms.
Well, the best way I think that I can describe it is this, is that when Barack Obama came into office, and many of us expected him to make systemic changes, he didn't do that. What he did, he went by case-by-case basis. I call it the Oprah Winfrey approach. You get a sentence commutation, you get a sentence commutation. So he never dug into any of the actual laws that were creating that disparity.
But I'm sorry, isn't
Trump on the other hand?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
On the other hand, he made changes to the actual laws themselves so that it will have a more system-wide effect. And so that's why I call it a systemic change, because he literally went into the legislation and changed it where Barack did not want to touch a letter of the crime bill prior to that.
Do you think Donald Trump's history with the First Step Act, something that was supported at the time by a lot of Republicans, although now obviously Donald Trump is being challenged. There are a number of other Republican candidates. I'm not sure exactly where each of them stands on that. I know some of them have expressed a desire to undo the First Step Act. Concerns about crime are starting to crowd some of the criminal justice consensus. Do you think this gives Trump an advantage over other Republicans, that he has this achievement on his record?
Of course. I mean, listen, Trump represents an opposition to, one, the status quo in general, and a rebellion, if you will, against the establishment leadership of the Republican Party. When he was calling for legislative change in this area, listen, he had to drag Mitch McConnell screaming and kicking over that line in order to get him to do it. So he spent a lot of political capital in order to force a lot of his own Republican party members to support this particular bill. So yes, in doing so, he distinguishes himself from the establishment leadership of his own party, of course.
What are the kinds of criminal justice reforms that you've heard about from Trump or other GOP candidates in the race right now that you're really looking forward to seeing implemented if one of them becomes president?
I'm going to tell you, I haven't heard any discussion from any of the other candidates about criminal reform. And I'm going to be very frank with you. I'm not looking forward to seeing anything in that area from DeSantis, who they're considering the second, runner-up, if you will. So in this area, Trump has been the only candidate. He's been the only former president who's actually addressed that particular issue square on, and he's made a significant, I consider, radical change in that direction.
What kind of policies, as a formerly incarcerated person, what policies are top in mind to help people maybe who aren't even in as good a situation as you are, be rehabilitated? We talk about recidivism in general. There's rising crime in some cities, not all cities. It can be painted as overly negative by the media. What do you think, from someone who's gone down this pathway in life and now has a lot to show for oneself, writing and speaking on these issues? What do formerly incarcerated people need so they can be rehabilitated in society without having to resort to these really punitive long sentences?
Well, outside of course, just like what you just addressed, there has to be a change in the sentences. The sentences have to be attached to punishing the person for the actual crime that they commit. And that's on the sentencing side. On the reentry side, what we need in order to keep recidivism down is the bare necessities. This house that I'm standing in right now, the only reason why I have this house is because my family has helped me and is providing that for me. Had I not had that, I would like to believe that I would still be able to, do positive things, but just that basic necessity of a house, clothing on your back, food, transportation, either organizations or family have to be able to provide that for those of us who are returning home if we want to really see a change in the recidivism rate.
When you spoke to the idea that sentences need to be in line with the actual crime committed, I presume you're alluding to kind of mandatory minimums and those policies which drove a marked increase in the incarcerated population. And I'm curious what you make of the emphasis that so many people who are running in the Republican primary and in the Republican Party more generally speaking, seem to attribute a rise in crime to lax prosecutors who aren't implementing long enough sentences for folks who are arrested and convicted of crimes. Do you think that that's what's driving crime rates in some cities that are going up?
What's driving crime rates is Joe Biden's terrible economic plan. That's what's driving crime rates, because that's always been what has driven crime rates. This narrative that somehow Black and brown people just want to commit crimes because they just want to do that, that is the most racist argument that can be made by either party. And I've seen candidates and individuals from both parties make that sort of argument. The problem is that within our communities, the economic opportunities are limited. And facing those limited economic opportunities, oftentimes crime is the thing that we often end up turning to. If there were more availability of meaningful jobs, meaningful education in those same areas, guess what? Crime would go down. So this whole, narrative, I reject that all the way.
It's interesting. In particular, there's been some discussion about Vivek Ramaswamy, for example, has advocated for cutting any number of agencies that have historically disproportionately provided opportunities for upward mobility for the Black community in particular. Especially in an earlier era in American history when there was so much employment discrimination, government jobs were some of the first jobs that really gave Black Americans an opportunity to enter the middle class. And I'm sure, as you know from life and personal experience, jobs as couriers, working for the USPS, things like that have always been significant opportunities for upward mobility for us. What do you make of the choice to say, I want to cut, I think he said 75% of the federal workforce, and the implication of what that means for the employment opportunities for working class people generally, but Black people specifically, given what you've just said about economic opportunities and the relationship between those economic opportunities and criminality?
I would like to hear what he's going to do on the balance. Okay, if you're going to get rid of these, government jobs and positions that many minorities are holding, what are you going to do on the private sector side that's going to now integrate them into the private sector? And if he's not presenting that, then you got to see what he's presenting as what it is. My mother went from social services to employment through a program that basically got her employment in the Social Security agency. So I know what that is, and I know that the improvement that did to our lives. So I'm not going to take a position as if to say, oh, well, yeah, we got to get rid of all of the government jobs. The problem is that we are underrepresented in the private sector. And what is he going to do about that? And until he has a program for that, I've got to be suspicious about what he's proposing.
Craig Scott, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.